Welcome back, everybody, to the Alyosha Society. Because you know what we're doing, don't you? Because you've heard me say it 100 times. We're pursuing truth and beauty and goodness through great literature. The literature we're looking at right now is, of course, The Killer Angels. This is video number 4 out of 10 total. And as I told you in the previous video, I brought the big guns, guys. I decided not to mess around with the amateurs, with the history buffs. I decided not to mess around with people who dabble in history. No, I brought the big guns. I brought Dr. John Wilsey, professor at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. John, welcome back.
Good to be back. Good to be back with you, Bruce Etter.
Appreciate that first video loaded with content. I feel like now we've got, I forgot to tell you this in a previous video. I actually started at 1800 in the first video, and I just gave like one of the most important events. I talked about Andrew Jackson a little bit, and we talked about the war with Mexico and Polk and expansion and all that. And you know, the content that you helped me with, the 5 pressures, the 3 sparks. Students, I want you to know those. I want you to know the 5 pressures, the 3 sparks, and the 1 stick of dynamite that blew it all up. But we're back today. You guys should have read the first half. The first half. Okay, so we're getting involved now of the Wednesday. So the first question we have here, John, is I think the most obvious question. Michael Shara does not mention, he doesn't have a separate section on Tuesday. Why would that be?
Well, Tuesday, June 30th, Lee's orders for the Army to concentrate had been sent out, and the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Corps were marching. They were marching. The 1st and 3rd Corps were in the neighborhood of Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. And then the 2nd Corps had been up towards Harrisburg, and they were headed south in the direction of Gettysburg on the 30th. So really not a lot's going on the 30th except the movements of the troops. And the Union Army, they are moving north from Frederick. I will say this, that George Meade, who was the commanding officer of the Union Army, he had originally intended to establish a defensive line along Pipe Creek, which was right down on the Pennsylvania-Maryland border. And it was very good ground, and he intended to defend that position because it was between Lee's army and Washington. And he was hoping that Lee might be tempted to come in and engage him at Pipe Creek. So anyway, all those dispositions were being made on the 30th. It's on the 1st that you have an accidental collision of the 2 armies.
Okay, that's helpful. So students, if and when, it's probably more like when, I ask you on a quiz or a test, what happened on Tuesday, June the 30th, you're going to basically say marching. So don't say nothing, because it's not nothing.
Nothing happened.
Yeah. So I mean, we got a 400-page novel here, and I think Michael Shara just thought I kind of want to lay the groundwork and get to the battle. So I think that's awesome. I think this is one of the questions I've been most excited about hearing you talk about, because I don't believe I know anyone on the planet who can do a better job of talking about this. We're living in an age now where folks want to tear down monuments. They want to rip down statues of historical figures if there's anything about them they don't like. I think that's horrific and dangerous, and I'm very much opposed to it. And that, you know, when you talk about these controversial characters in history, Robert E. Lee is definitely at the top of the list. The folks that hate him despise him, and in many ways have turned him into someone that he absolutely was not. There's no doubt about that. And then the folks who revere him other than you, because I believe that you have the balanced approach. But folks that revere him maybe tend to do what we always do with our heroes, and that is sort of turn them into angelic heroes that didn't have any faults or problems. What we're going to get here, and students, you're not going to get this anywhere else. Okay? What we're going to get here is the truth. And Dr. Wilsey, I want you to introduce us to Robert E. Lee, almost in a way like you're introducing us to a friend, to someone you really know, because I know that you really have that kind of knowledge of him. Before you do that, and as you're thinking about it, I'm going to read out loud the first paragraph of this section of students. If you have your books handy, you should pull them out. I'm at Wednesday, July the 1st, 1863, the first day. In my copy, it's page 77. And I don't know that there are that many editions of this book that have come out. So hopefully it's the same page, but here goes. The chapter is called Lee. He came out of the tent into a fine, cold rain. The troops were already up and moving out on the misty road beyond the trees. Some of them saw the white head and came to the fence to stare at him. The ground rocked. Lee floated, clutched the tent, got up too quickly, must move slowly with care. Brian came out of the mist bearing steaming coffee in a metal cup. Lee took it in pained hands, drank, felt the heat soak down through him like hot liquid sunshine. This is pretty darn good writing, by the way. I'll just say that.
Yeah.
The dizziness passed. There was fog, flat and low in the treetops, like a soft roof. The rain was clean on his face. He walked slowly to the rail where the horses were tethered. Gentle traveler, skittish Lucy Long. Stuart had not come back in the night. If Stuart had come, they would have wakened him. He said good morning to the beautiful gray horse. The great soft eyes said a silent prayer. He thought, tonight we'll all be together. That's really a wonderful introduction there. So what I'm looking at here, John, is the students are going to read the book. We're not just going to reiterate everything that's in the book. I want to do something they're not going to get in the book. And let's talk about two things. Some things that our culture has, they have just grown to believe this, not by any deep study, not by any real truth. Things that our culture has grown to believe that actually are not even really true about Robert E. Lee. And the second part is some things that are absolutely true, but not that many folks seem to be aware of that. So I'm just going to wind you up and let you go, man.
Well, Robert E. Lee is about the same age as Lincoln. He was born in Stratford, Virginia. His father was a Revolutionary War hero, nicknamed Light Horse Harry. If you've ever heard the expression, first in war, first in peace, first in the hearts of his countrymen, that's a eulogy about George Washington. And that was coined by Light Horse Harry Lee, Robert E. Lee's father.
Okay.
They were, Light Horse Harry Lee was one of Washington's lieutenants. And Light Horse Harry Lee was also addicted to sort of, speculating in land, a kind of a gambling man.
Okay.
He lost his shirt. And when Lee was 13 years old, I believe he was about 13, his father left and never came back. Lee married Martha Custis, who was the granddaughter, I guess the step-granddaughter, I should say, of George Washington. Her father, George Washington Custis, had been a stepson of George Washington and inherited Arlington. So when Lee married Martha, he was Arlington plantation was not Lee's property. It was his by marriage. He also inherited George Washington Custis's slaves. And when Custis died in 1857, 58, somewhere in there, I can't remember exactly, late 1850s, Custis had provided for all of their freedom in his will. And Lee carried out his wishes and freed all of those slaves that were on the Arlington plantation. So a lot of people don't know that. A lot of people think, oh, Lee was fighting to, keep slavery and all that. He actually freed all of the slaves that were, he didn't own any of his own slaves. He came into ownership of slaves through marriage, and then he freed them all. By 1862, they were all free. That's one thing people don't know about Lee. Another thing people don't know about Lee was that he opposed secession and he opposed slavery. He had always been a Union man. He was a Union man all the way until very, very late in the secession crisis. And he only he resigned from the Army only after his home state, Virginia, had seceded from the Union, because he believed that Virginia was his first loyalty, and whatever Virginia did, he was bound to do the same. So a lot of people don't know that he was opposed in principle to secession and to slavery.
Wow.
A lot of people don't know that he had a horrible temper. He had a tempestuous temper. He did in a rage whip one of the slaves on Arlington's property. He didn't think that the overseer was laying it in thick enough, so he stepped in and took the whip from the overseer's hands, and he carried out the whipping. It was in a rage. He lost his temper with his lieutenants after the Battle of Chancellorsville, which was his greatest victory. He did not see it as he saw it as a victory, but he did not see it as his greatest victory, because his ambition was to sew up the Union Army once and for all by cutting off their escape routes over the Rappahannock River. And he had given orders to his subordinate generals to accomplish that, and they didn't carry it out. And he said to them, you young men are all the same. I give you orders and you don't follow them. So that was something common to him. He had a temper. He's known in the popular imagination as what people called him as the marble man, hiding his emotions and things like that. He was pretty good at that, but he did have a temper, and many people saw his temper flash out on those memorable occasions. But Lee was tall. He had massive shoulders. He had massive hands, and he had a large head.
So he was like a truly larger than life kind of character in many ways.
He had the physical presence that people envy. And he knew how to ride a horse, and he knew how to sit on a horse. He had an awareness of himself in a lot of the ways, similar ways as George Washington did. George Washington also tall and a massive physical, person.
Right.
And everything that Washington did, he knew was precedent setting. And Lee didn't exactly have the same view of himself, but he did know that he had an opportunity to inspire his men through his physical appearance. And so he would cultivate a particular image. Yeah.
That's fascinating. Yeah. Like how many of you knew that? How many of you knew that he was? Can you talk a little bit about, I want to bring our vocabulary and make sure our students are keeping up. Students, you've heard Dr. Wilson use the term secession several times, and I know that you probably know what that is. But John, can you just elaborate a little bit more on how do we know that he was in principle opposed to secession? And if you don't mind, remember, I've got 8th, 9th, 10th grade students in here. They may not have a dictionary handy. Remind them what secession means. And how do we know that Robert E. Lee was actually opposed to it? That seems like the most unlikely thing imaginable.
Well, remember that in 1787, when the Constitution was drafted, it was ratified and went into effect in 1789 when the first Congress met in March, and then Washington was inaugurated first president in April of 1789. The states, in order for the Constitution to go into effect, the states had to ratify it. 9 states out of the 13 had to ratify. By the summer of 1788, I believe New York was the 9th state. I could be wrong about that, but I believe New York was the 9th state, July of 1788, that made the Constitution, accepted among a quorum of states, 3/4 of the state. The states, between the Revolution and the Civil War, the states believed that they were sovereign. And the southern states in particular believed that they were sovereign and that they had come into the Union voluntarily. That they had, voted to ratify the Constitution in 1787 and 88. And by implication, they could leave whenever they didn't think that their interests were being served by being in the Union. The southern states weren't the only states to ever threaten secession. The New England states very nearly seceded from the Union in 1814 during the War of 1812. So secession was not just a southern thing. It's also a northern thing at another point in American history. But it goes back to the idea of what is a state. And in the years before the Civil War, that question would have been answered by most people as a state is sovereign. And the Union itself is a union of sovereign states. And one way to think about that is today we have United States citizenship. And that's defined by statute. It's defined in the Constitution by the 14th Amendment. Everybody born in the United States or on sovereign United States territory. So you might have been born in an embassy overseas. You may have been born on a military base overseas. That's sovereign U.S. territory. And you're a citizen if you're born in the United States. Prior to the 14th Amendment, which was ratified in 1868, went into effect in 1868, 3 years after the war was over, there's no statutory definition of what an American citizen was. You were a citizen of your state, but there was no statute defining United States citizenship. In other words, there was no such thing.
Yeah.
And that's not to say that some people didn't see it that way. A lot of people called themselves Americans. A lot of people said the United States is my country and so forth. But there were at least as many people who thought of citizenship as being limited to the state and never to the country, the Union, because there was no official designation for that. There was no statute that defended that. So when Lee, and how do we know Lee was against secession? Because he said so. He said so on numerous occasions in private correspondence and things that he said, leading up to the election of Abraham Lincoln and during the secession crisis that lasted from December of 1860 through April of 1861. He said so. We know that because he made it very clear that he was opposed to secession. He was a Union man. He'd been in the Army, spent his entire career in the Army, the United States Army. He had just been promoted to colonel in the United States Army. So he was thoroughly a Union man. He had seen the Union. He'd been to Texas. He'd been to New York. He, of course, was born in Virginia. He had been all over the country. He had seen the country in a way that most people would never have seen it. He was a Union man through and through, but he saw his loyalty was to Virginia first because Virginia was his home state and Virginia was where his family was from.
I think what you've shared here about Lee kind of tears down that very false image of him that he was sort of this calculating, diabolical, racist, secessionist. He wasn't really any of those things. And that's fascinating. That's absolutely fascinating. But I think it's important too, students, when we look at individuals in history, that we accept the fact that they're flawed, sinful, as C.S. Lewis would say, bent human beings, just like you and me, but still can exhibit worthy and heroic qualities. That's really good. So here's what I want to do. Here's what I want to do, Dr. Wilsey. This is going to be like, this is video number 4, then video number 5 is all going to be Wednesday. All right. So just to kind of keep, so I don't have my students watching, a 55-minute video, then a 4-minute video, kind of spread out a little bit. Let's do this. Is there any way, would it be possible to set the stage, maybe the morning of July the 1st? I know you're going to kill me for this. I'm glad we're like 9 hours away right now, because you'd strangle me. Can you do that in 3 minutes or less? And then the next video, we'll just really break down Wednesday more. Have at it.
The morning of July 1st, Harry Heath, who is division commander under A.P. Hill, who commanded the 3rd Corps, wanted to go into Gettysburg to get shoes. And he needed, shoes for that sounds like a strange thing, why would they need shoes? At least a quarter of the soldiers in the Confederate Army were barefoot. Marched barefoot for mile after mile after mile. And so he wanted to go into Gettysburg because there was a rumor that there were shoes. Now, how did the rumor get around? Well, Jubal Early had been through Gettysburg about maybe a week before. I could be wrong about the timeline, but he had been through Gettysburg with his division, and they had requisitioned all kinds of supplies from the town. And so the rumor had it that there were still some shoes left in Gettysburg. He wanted to go get those shoes. He was determined to go get those shoes. In fact, he may have even asked Hill for permission. I think he asked for permission on the night of June 30th. And he was convinced that there was only Pennsylvania militia, which would easily be swept aside. And Hill's response, in just immortal words, the question was, do you have any objection to my taking my division to Gettysburg in the morning?
Mm-hmm.
And Hill's words were fateful and immortal. He said, none in the world.
So that's going to set the stage for us right there. That's awesome. So friends, this has been video number 4 out of 10 total on Michael Schar's book, The Killer Angels. So I think we've really got the stage set now. Friends, if the stage isn't set by now, my goodness, we got 4 pretty long videos trying to get this plane going. So in the next video, guys, we're going to be digging into Wednesday, July the 1st. So students, I want you to go ahead and finish reading all. So go ahead and read the second half of Wednesday, July the 1st. And guess what? Dr. Wilson, can you come back?
Glad to, man.
Okay. All right. See you then, kids.